The courtroom air crackled with tension so thick it could choke you. A black man, Daniel Carter, stood at the defendant's table, his hands trembling, sweat beading on his brow under the glare of fluorescent lights. He was no stranger to judgment, but today, it felt like the world was pressing down on his chest, waiting for him to break. This wasn't just a trial. It was a crucible. Daniel, a 32-year-old mechanic from a small Georgia town, faced charges of assaulting a police officer-era white officer, no less during a traffic stop gone wrong. The accusation alone was enough to paint him guilty in the eyes of many in this room. Whispers slithered through the crowd like snakes, their venom laced with assumptions about his character, his skin, his very existence. But Daniel wasn't here to fight just for himself. He carried the weight of every sidelong glance, every locked car door, every "you don't belong here" etched into his life. The judge, a grizzled man named Harold Grayson, slammed his gavel, the sound sharp enough to slice through the murmurs. "Mr. Carter," he bellowed, his voice a thunderclap, "you will answer the question. Did you or did you not strike Officer Bennett?" His eyes burned into Daniel, who stood frozen, his throat tight. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. Daniel's lawyer, Sarah Ellison, a fierce woman with a reputation for taking on impossible cases, leaned close, whispering, "Stay calm, Daniel. Just tell the truth." But the truth? The truth was a dangerous thing in a place like this. Daniel's mind flashed to that night humid, the air thick with the scent of asphalt and fear. He'd been driving home from his second job, bone-tired, when the red and blue lights flared behind him. Officer Bennett's voice had been sharp, accusing, demanding his license with a tone that assumed guilt before a word was spoken. Daniel had complied, hands raised, heart pounding, knowing one wrong move could end him. But then Bennett's hand went to his holster, and Daniel's instinct kicked in not to fight, but to protect. He'd pushed the officer's arm away, a reflex born of survival. That single act had landed him here, in this courtroom, labeled a criminal. "Mr. Carter." Judge Grayson's shout snapped him back. "I won't ask again. Did you strike the officer?" The judge's face was red, veins bulging at his temples. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for Daniel's response, some hoping for his downfall, others praying for a miracle. Daniel's mouth was dry, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt him, Your Honor. I was scared." His words hung in the air, fragile, like they might shatter under the weight of the room's scrutiny. Sarah squeezed his arm, her eyes urging him to keep going. But the prosecutor, a slick man named Richard Holt, pounced. "Scared?" he sneered, pacing before the jury. "Scared enough to assault an officer of the law? You expect us to believe that, Mr. Carter?" The jury, a mix of faces, some sympathetic, others stone-cold shifted in their seats. Daniel could feel their judgment, the way it clung to him like damp clothes. He wasn't just on trial for what happened that night. He was on trial for who he was, a black man in a system that too often saw his skin as evidence enough. Sarah stood, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, my client acted in self-defense." Officer Bennett drew his weapon without provocation. Mr. Carter had every reason to fear for his life. She turned to the jury, her gaze steady. "This case isn't just about one night. It's about a pattern of fear, of assumptions, of lives judged before they're even lived." Holt scoffed, adjusting his tie. "Self-defense? Your Honor, this is a clear case of a man with no respect for authority. Mr. Carter has a history: petty theft at 17, a bar fight at 22. He's no stranger to trouble." The words landed like punches, each one twisting the truth to fit a narrative Daniel knew too well. Yes, he'd made mistakes, but they were the mistakes of youth, not proof of some inherent criminality. Yet Holt wielded them like weapons, and the jury's eyes narrowed. Daniel's heart sank. He glanced at his sister, Maya, in the gallery, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were pale. She'd driven 3 hours to be here, her face a mask of worry and love. Beside her sat their mother, Ruth, her eyes glistening but fierce, whispering prayers under her breath. They were his anchor, his reason to keep standing. But even their presence couldn't shield him from the storm in this room. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his voice low but menacing. "Mr. Carter, I've heard enough excuses. You will explain yourself, or I'll hold you in contempt." The threat was a blade at Daniel's throat, and for a moment, he felt like he was back in that car. Lights flashing, a gun in his face. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. He wanted to scream, to tell the world what it was like to live in a body that was always a suspect, always a threat. But words failed him. Sarah, sensing his struggle, stepped in. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess. My client needs a moment to compose himself." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. 10 minutes, he snapped, banging the gavel. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Daniel was led to a side room. His legs shaky, his mind racing. In the cramped room, Sarah sat across from him, her voice soft but urgent. "Daniel, you have to speak. The jury needs to hear you, not Holt's version of you. Tell them what happened, tell them who you are." Daniel shook his head, his voice hoarse. "They won't listen, Sarah. They never do. They see me, and they see a problem." Sarah leaned closer, her eyes blazing with conviction. "Then make them listen. You're not just fighting for you, you're fighting for every person who's been in your shoes. Don't let them silence you." Daniel stared at the floor, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought of his mother, who'd worked double shifts to keep him fed. Of Maya, who'd believed in him when he doubted himself. Of every time he'd been stopped, questioned, dismissed because of his skin. The anger, the fear, the exhaustion, it all surged up, threatening to drown him. But beneath it was something else. A spark of defiance, a refusal to let this moment define him. Back in the courtroom, the air was heavier, the crowd restless. Grayson's gavel fell again, silencing the room. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone sharp, "I expect an answer now. Did you strike Officer Bennett? And if so, why?" Daniel stood, his hands still trembling but his voice steadier now. "Your Honor, I pushed his arm because I thought he was going to shoot me. I wasn't trying to hurt him, I was trying to live." The words spilled out, raw and unpolished, but they carried a truth that silenced the room for a heartbeat. The jury leaned forward, some faces softening, others still skeptical. Holt jumped up, his voice dripping with disdain. "Trying to live? That's your defense? You expect this court to believe you felt threatened by a routine stop?" He turned to the jury, his smile smug. "This is a man who thinks he's above the law, who uses fear as an excuse for violence." Sarah was on her feet before he finished. "Objection. The prosecution is mischaracterizing my client's actions and ignoring the context of systemic bias that led to this incident." Her voice was fire, her words a challenge to the room's conscience. Grayson sustained the objection, but the damage was done. Holt's narrative lingered, a poison in the air. Daniel's eyes scanned the jury, searching for a flicker of understanding. He saw it in a few faces, a young woman with kind eyes, an older man who nodded slightly but others looked away, their minds already made up. He wanted to scream, to make them see the world through his eyes, but all he could do was speak. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stronger now, "I've spent my life trying to do right. I work 2 jobs, I take care of my family, I keep my head down. But that night I wasn't a mechanic or a brother or a son. I was just a black man, and that was enough for Officer Bennett to see me as a threat. I pushed his arm because I didn't want to die." The room went still. Even Holt paused, his smirk faltering. Sarah's eyes shone with pride, but Daniel wasn't done. He took a breath, his voice rising, steady but laced with years of pain. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a man who's tired of being judged, tired of being afraid, tired of a system that assumes I'm guilty before I even open my mouth." Then came the sentence that stopped the courtroom cold. "If being scared for my life is a crime, then lock me up, but don't pretend this is justice." The silence was deafening. Grayson's face was unreadable, his gavel still. The jury stared, some with wide eyes, others with furrowed brows. Maya's hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Ruth sat taller, her prayers now a silent chant of hope. Even Holt seemed caught off guard, his next words stuck in his throat. Sarah seized the moment, her voice steady but fierce. "Your Honor, my client's actions were not those of a criminal but of a man pushed to the edge by a system that too often fails people like him. We ask the jury to consider the truth, not the assumptions, not the stereotypes, but the reality of what it means to live under constant suspicion." The trial stretched on, each moment a battle. Witnesses took the stand: Officer Bennett, with his polished uniform and rehearsed story, a bystander who'd seen the stop and confirmed Daniel's fear, a community leader who spoke of the town's history of racial tension. Every word was a brick in the wall between justice and injustice, and Daniel felt the weight of each one. As the jury deliberated, Daniel sat with Sarah in the holding room, his mind a storm of hope and dread. "Do you think they heard me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him, her eyes steady. "Some did. And sometimes that's enough." The holding room was suffocating, its walls too close, the air stale with the scent of old coffee and despair. Daniel Carter sat on a metal chair, his hands clasped tightly, as if holding himself together. Sarah Ellison, his lawyer, paced the small space, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "They've been deliberating for 6 hours, she said, glancing at her watch. "That's a good sign. It means they're thinking, not just rushing to judgment." Daniel nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the trial's final moments. The prosecution had hammered their case, painting him as a volatile man who'd lashed out at authority. Officer Bennett's testimony had been smooth, practiced, his voice steady as he described Daniel's aggression. But there were cracks in his story: the bystander's account, a shaky cell phone video that showed Bennett's hand on his gun before Daniel's push. Sarah had torn into those cracks, her closing argument a blaze of passion and logic, urging the jury to see the human behind the accusations. "Do you think they believe me?" Daniel asked, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the fluorescent lights. Sarah stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto his. "I think you spoke your truth, Daniel. That's more powerful than anything Holt could throw at you. Some of them heard you, I saw it in their faces." He wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. He'd seen the jury's eyes, some soft, some hard, some unreadable. He knew what it was like to be judged by people who didn't know his world, who couldn't feel the weight of every glance, every assumption. Growing up in a town where driving while black was a risk, Daniel had learned early to keep his head down, to smile through gritted teeth, to survive. But survival wasn't enough anymore. He wanted justice not just for himself, but for his sister Maya, his mother Ruth, and every person who'd ever felt the same invisible chains. The door creaked open, and a bailiff stepped in. "They're ready," he said, his tone neutral but heavy with implication. Daniel's heart lurched. Sarah squeezed his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "Whatever happens, you fought. You showed them who you are." Back in the courtroom, the air was electric, charged with anticipation. The crowd hushed as the jury filed in, their faces a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Judge Grayson's stern gaze swept over them, his gavel resting like a guillotine. Daniel stood, his legs unsteady, Maya and Ruth in the gallery clutching each other's hands. Sarah stood beside him, her posture defiant, a shield against the storm. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Grayson asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind but weary eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." She handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Grayson. The judge's face remained impassive as he read it, then handed it back. "Please read the verdict." Daniel's breath caught. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. The foreperson cleared her throat. "On the charge of assaulting a police officer, we find the defendant, Daniel Carter, not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cheers, and angry murmurs collided in a chaotic wave. Maya sobbed, her hands covering her face, while Ruth whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Daniel's knees buckled, and Sarah caught his arm, her own eyes glistening. "You did it," she whispered. "You made them listen." But the victory felt fragile, like it could shatter under the weight of the glares from some in the crowd. Holt, the prosecutor, sat stone-faced, his jaw tight. Officer Bennett, seated behind him, stared straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists. The verdict was a crack in the system, but not a collapse. Daniel knew that outside these walls, the world hadn't changed. Grayson banged his gavel, silencing the room. "Order!" he barked, his face still stern but softer now, almost reflective. "Mr. Carter, you are free to go. But let this be a lesson: respect for the law is paramount." The words stung, a reminder that even in victory, Daniel was still seen as a cautionary tale. He nodded, swallowing the urge to speak, knowing silence was safer. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel felt the weight of eyes on him, some proud, some hostile. A white man in a suit muttered something under his breath as he passed, the word "lucky" cutting through the noise. A young black woman approached, her eyes shining. "You did good," she said softly, then disappeared into the crowd. Each interaction was a thread in the tapestry of a divided world, one Daniel navigated every day. Outside, the Georgia sun was brutal, the air thick with humidity. Maya and Ruth enveloped him in a hug, their tears soaking his shirt. "I knew you'd come through," Maya said, her voice breaking. Ruth just held him, her grip fierce, as if afraid he'd vanish. Sarah stood nearby, giving them space, her phone buzzing with messages from colleagues and reporters. But the celebration was short-lived. As they walked to Sarah's car, a group of men lingered nearby, their stares heavy with resentment. One spat on the ground, his voice low but clear. "This ain't over." Daniel's stomach twisted, the familiar chill of fear creeping back. The verdict had freed him, but it hadn't erased the divide that pulsed through this town, this country. Sarah drove them to a diner on the edge of town, a place where Daniel felt safe, where the staff knew his name and didn't flinch when he walked in. Over coffee and pie, they talked not about the trial but about life. Maya shared stories of her nursing school. Ruth spoke of her garden, and Daniel, for the first time in months, laughed. It was a small rebellion, this moment of joy, but it felt like defiance against a world that wanted to break him. That night, Daniel sat on his porch, the cicadas humming in the dark. He thought of the trial, of the jury's faces, of that one sentence he'd spoken. "If being scared for my life is a crime, then lock me up, but don't pretend this is justice." It had come from a place deeper than anger, a place where pain and hope collided. He wondered if it had changed anything, if it had reached anyone beyond that courtroom. The next morning, the local paper ran a story on the trial, the headline bold, "Not guilty. Mechanics' words shake court." The article quoted his sentence, calling it a raw plea for understanding. Social media buzzed, some praising his courage, others decrying the verdict as a miscarriage of justice. Daniel scrolled through the comments, his heart heavy. For every voice of support, there was another dripping with hate, proof that the divide ran deeper than any courtroom could bridge. Sarah called, her voice bright but cautious. "You're a symbol now, Daniel. People are talking about you, about the system, about what's broken. It's not just your story anymore." He wasn't sure he wanted to be a symbol, but he couldn't deny the ripple effect. Community meetings were planned, protests organized, discussions sparked. His words had lit a match, and though the fire was small, it burned. Weeks later, Daniel returned to work at the auto shop, the familiar smell of oil and metal grounding him. His co-workers clapped him on the back, their smiles genuine, but he noticed the customers who avoided his bay, the ones who whispered when he passed. Change was slow and trust was hard-won. Still, he showed up every day, fixing cars, joking with his crew, living. One evening, a young man approached him at the shop, nervous, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "I saw you on the news," he said. "I'm black too. Been stopped, same as you. What you said in court, it made me feel seen." Daniel listened, his chest tight, and offered the kid a soda. They talked for an hour about fear, about hope, about surviving in a world that didn't always want them to. As the months passed, Daniel became a quiet advocate, speaking at local events, sharing his story. He didn't want fame, only understanding. He met with Sarah often, planning ways to push for reform, better training for officers, more transparency in the system. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. 1 year after the trial, Daniel stood at a community vigil, a candle in his hand, surrounded by faces of every color. They were there to honor those lost to injustice, to demand a better future. He spoke, his voice steady, echoing that day in court. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," he said. "We're fighting for a world where no one has to be afraid to live." The crowd was quiet, then erupted in applause, some wiping tears, others nodding fiercely. Daniel looked out at them, his heart full but heavy. The fight wasn't over, it might never be, but in that moment, he felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. What's right, what's wrong, what's justice? Where do you stand when the community is divided?